We knew this was going to be huge.
We put all of our love and dedication into that one single set.
I've probably watched them at least 20 times each.
It does definitely feel sometimes like it's our own Fellowship of the Ring.
My name is Mike. I am a senior master model designer, and I'm here to talk about our newest Lord of the Rings set, Minas Tirith. I think it was quite cool how we were this fellowship.
So like Mike says, we are forming our own little fellowship of designers.
I'm flattered when people say that I'm kind of like Gandalf, but I wouldn't make that comparison myself. At the LEGO Group, we have a week each year in product development where we can kind of just do things that we think are interesting. I made this model that was the Balrog versus Gandalf, kind of recreate that battle. And people kind of looked at that model and they're like, this is like abjectly terrifying. So that model just kind of like sat on a shelf for some years. And then in 2022, my creative lead came to me and said, we're actually thinking about maybe this is the time now that we do a Lord of the Rings thing. And I was like, I got it, Jamie. I've got the Balrog right here. And he's like, no. Let's go to Rivendell.
It was a very challenging project that resulted into a beautiful build by Mike, Wes, and Chris.
We were all very excited, and we were kind of like pinching ourselves, like, I can't believe that we're getting to do this finally. But we also kept saying, like, this is it. This is our one Lord of the Rings model. And so we were putting everything in it.
The results came in from our fans, and we could saw that it was just this overjoy of love.
And then Jamie came back and he's like, right, what's next? And we're like, oh. We hadn't considered that we were ever going to do another thing.
So then the idea of Barad-dûr came in. This massive tower for the bad guys with the glowing eye on the top.
We had Bag End, which is, again, kind of like a tranquil model. And so when we're trying to figure out, like, where do we go in this universe?
The next ask is coming in. Okay, what else could we expand?
You have the Black Tower of Sauron, and then you have the White City of Gondor. And they make such a lovely juxtaposition. So we thought, why not try to do that as a Lego model? How would you do that? How would you make that? Because you can't take a slice of Minas Tirith. It's the whole city, but you can't necessarily also just completely zoom out. And that's where Francois really stepped in and said, I have an idea of how we can make this thing work.
When you look at the city, it's circular and you have 7 layers. The idea was to flatten a little bit the entire model, so it's not entirely circular. And also, we decided to cut it in the middle behind the Tower of Ectelion.
We would mix the scales, but not just kind of exterior, interior like on Barad-dûr, but actually mix scales throughout the whole model.
You have all those tiny houses all around that gives away the scale. How can you find some clever ways to still have the minifigs interacting with the build without compromising too much on the shape, on the iconic features of the city? When you are standing in front of a tall building, what is in front of you appears bigger. And when you look up to the building, everything else is kind of smaller and smaller. And that's exactly what we try to recreate with this thing. So you can see the different section of Minas Tirith getting smaller and smaller, just like in real life when you're looking at a tall building.
Francois had a concept model that looked great, and by our kind of like, finger in the air guess, like, yeah, I think that's doable in this amount of time. And then the more that he worked on it, we realized quite quickly, this is too much for one person to do on their own.
And then Gondor called for aid, just like in the movie. And Mike jumped in.
So we decided to split the model into levels. I took the top 4 levels.
And I took the 2 bottom levels.
So if you're counting, I had 4 levels, which was more.
Yeah, but my levels are bigger.
But I guess if you really count, 4 is bigger than 2, so I kind of had more levels to do.
I don't think so.
Well, this city's not really doomed, is it? If you asked Denethor, it was.
Working with Mike is always fun. I think we are both sharing a passion with weird geometry, and
we do a lot of silly math at work.
So with this model, we were both happy with it because there are a lot of funny triangles Pythagorean triplets.
Francois would come to me and be like, look, Mike, I found another spot where I can connect in. Or I would come running over to him like, look at the way these two
Grids are coming together with no gaps, and we are super happy when we found some clever techniques.
Not every Lego model requires this much math. I always talk about how round things are not very good to make from square Lego bricks, but we always find a way. It was so much fun to figure all of that out and get to a point where it would all fit together seamlessly and be this one big, strong structure. It's a city of 7 levels, and you have the ground level that's extending out on this plain, the Pelennor Fields, and then you have 6 more levels of walls going up all the way until you get to the top, where you have the Citadel, they call it. When I joined the project, Francois had worked out 6 of the levels. We were going back and forth, like, does it really need to have 7 levels? Like, does anyone know that? Can you even see it? And everyone we talked to was like, you don't need to put in 7 levels. It's fine.
Mike and I, we looked at each other and said, let's make it happen.
We've already made this model way bigger than we were supposed to make it. If we go back now and say, hey guys, we're gonna make it bigger, we knew we couldn't do that. So we had to
find a way to sneak that extra level that we were missing into the model. Basically, we reduced the size of some walls, the lower section, trimmed off a couple of bricks at the top of the walls, trying to squish everything, and we managed to put the 7th layer.
I'm not sure of the exact number, but I think when Francois started out on this model, the goal was something like 4,000 pieces. I think when I joined the project, it was at 6,000.
Actually, I didn't focus a lot on the piece count.
They were like, all right, you're gonna help him get that down, right? And I was like, yeah, I'm gonna help you get that down. And we ended at 8,000, so how did I do? Maybe not the greatest job of bringing the parts count down. One of the biggest challenges was actually that it's made mostly of white pieces. In Innovation House, where we work, all of our tables have white surfaces. When you dump out the bricks and then try to find the one that you want, this becomes very difficult. We started to get so frustrated trying to find these parts. I just took a cardboard box and ripped it up and laid it out on the table so I'd have a different color surface. And just getting to put that other surface underneath the pieces as we built made it so much easier. It's actually quite funny. It was so bad to the point that now for the rooms where we have these model reviews, we've replaced all the tables with this, I'm not even gonna say the color because it's top secret, but it's not white.
We were almost close to the design freeze with this model, the point where you locked everything and the model is done. And Marianne was sitting with us through all the quality meetings, building the model, giving inputs and feedback.
My name is Marianne. I've been at Lego for 38 years and done the BI for 28 years.
Marianne had taken so many notes and given us so much feedback of things that we needed to adjust.
And Marianne, she had an accident and she broke her arm playing tennis.
I was just laying there and one of the other players was saying, this is not looking good. I have to realize that I couldn't work. I knew that I have to hand it over to one of my colleagues.
It was at this point that Eske jumped in and helped.
I knew that the model would be safe at Eske's table.
And Francois and I kind of looked at each other and we were like, is this maybe a golden opportunity? I bet there's some stuff we could sneak by him.
Be aware of Mike because he is the type that can figure out to cheat you a little bit. You have said no, but maybe he will try to do something.
He just came with this huge pile of notes from Marianne. I was like, all right, so I have all these notes. And we were just like, ugh.
I took over. I was a bit nervous. It's the first set that I've done that's even close to this size. Just having here's the model that Marianne carried on her shoulders through all these meetings. You have to quality check it. Does it build the way it should? Because it's such a big model, I don't think you ever picked it up. I did find some small pieces that actually came off, so we changed that. So at least I feel like contributed a little bit there. Yeah. But it was so good.
Of course, the locations are super inspirational, but in the end, as a viewer and as a fan, you mostly relate to the characters of the movie, which are translated into Lego minifigures. Of course, we are also having our partnership with Warner Brothers, and they are sending all type of reference that they can find. So we sometimes see very interesting details that you don't pick up in the movies. One particular example is Gandalf the White. So in the movies, it looks like he just has white robes, basically. But if you really zoom into his outfit, you can see that it has all types of embroidery details within his type of shirt that he is having on. I never seen these details, but looking at these type of production photography, it really stand out to me. And I've put that detail into the minifigure as well.
I am an element designer. Together with my colleagues, we create new elements for all the sets. Everything we make is supposed to work across our portfolio, and the first element that was made was Aragorn's wig with the crown. You can see a lot of details on the crown. I think in this case, representing the character was really important, of course. The second element is the Gondor Guard helmet, and it's in a metallic special effect that we have. At this point, we were trying to look into a new process to make these elements. We have a platform that is called low volume molding, which is what we use when we want to scale down the quantity of the elements that we're gonna mold. And we try to make it as efficient as possible. This is a 3x scale prototype of the element. We use this whenever we have a doubt that maybe a surface is curving in a weird way and I need to fix it. We sit down with the engineer and we say, hey, do you think it's actually a problem? If you can't see any problem at 3x the scale, you basically will not be able to see it. And then the other thing why I grabbed this prototype is just to show the level of abstraction or stylization of the wings. I wanted to make them look less organic because I still wanted to retain the idea that this is a detail sculpted on a metallic helmet and not actual wings that are attached to the side of the helmet.
At one point in the design process, we were thinking about, can we include a coordination scene between King Aragorn and Arwen? But in the movie, we saw that Arwen is actually holding the banner of Gondor. But it was very hard to get that reference. We tried to look up with our partner, can we get the best reference in it? And we were making still frames of the scene. I got some early prototypes here. As you can see, it was cut off because we thought that the banner was not going down anymore. Luckily, some designers came to the design meeting and they said, no, it's really a longer banner and it's going into a tip. But we were not sure about the type of graphic that would continue. Luckily, I could find online some images of very early production, I think, and that's then how it ended up. You can see that the tree is there, but also the type of graphic that is going down into the tip of the flag.
A lot of people, when they're thinking about Denethor, the first thing that comes up to their mind is the scene where there's a close-up on his mouth eating tomatoes, and it's disgusting. So that's why we found it really funny to give him some tomatoes. We also managed to build on the outer walls a tiny market stall where you can buy fish, bread, and tomatoes. In the movie, for a split second, you can see a chicken. We found it really funny to include it in the model, and we had to come up with a name for him. We decided to call him Amon Hen.
You have the chambers where Gandalf finds information about the One Ring, but you also have their living quarters where they have the balcony and can look over the Pelennor fields and stuff like that.
We really wanted to add the One Ring. The only thing is the One Ring isn't at any moment during the movies in Minas Tirith. But we find a way to put a tiny vignette where the ring is next to a microscale river, referencing Isildur is losing the ring, and that's a cool little Easter egg.
One of the parts that for me was especially fun to work on was at the upper levels of the city where we have the Citadel. There's kind of like this spur of rock that sticks out from the mountain. And for that section, it's the same geometry that I used to make the prow of the Lego Titanic.
Funny thing is the actor playing King Theoden is actually also playing the captain of the Titanic in the James Cameron movie.
We were, this fellowship working together with people coming in, people coming out. We're facing adversity, we're facing unexpected challenges.
Yeah, it does definitely feel sometimes like it's our own fellowship of the ring.
Then you would be like Gandalf.
Thank you. I think.
You're the old wise one, and then you sort of had to step aside for a bit. I think I'd just be Pippin.
I think if you consider yourself anything more than one of the hobbits, you're probably imagine yourself a little bit more grand than you really are.
I kinda identify as a dwarf.
Can I be Legolas?
I think as a team we are always very proud that we have done yet another Lord of the Rings set.
It was such an inspiring team to be a part of, and I'm so happy with what we achieved.
Designing this, it was a journey, an unexpected journey.
One ring to rule them all.
Eén ring om hen te vinden.
Un anneau pour les amener.
Og i mørket binde dem. That's very cool to say.